Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about unsupervised learning. So the reading for this topic is chapter 12 of Intro to Statistical Learning. So to begin with, today we are going to explore a very interesting and very different type of statistical learning, something that we have not done so far, and I think it's really interesting. So what exactly is unsupervised learning? And to understand that, it's best to just take a quick recap of what we understand by supervised learning as well. Well, in supervised learning, we have both features X and a response variable Y. And our goal here is pretty straightforward. We try to predict Y using X through tools like regressions or classifications. But unsupervised learning takes a different approach. We only have features X, but no response variable to guide us. There is no right answer that we are trying to predict. Instead, we are exploring the data to discover hidden patterns, structures, and relationships that might not be immediately obvious. Think of it in this way. Supervised learning is like having a map with a clear destination marked. But unsupervised learning is more like exploring without any specific target in mind. You try to understand the terrain itself. It's about letting the data speak to us and reveal its inherent nature or structure. So, what are we trying to accomplish with unsupervised learning? Broadly speaking, we want to discover interesting patterns in our data that might not be apparent at first glance. Our common goal is to find informative ways to visualize complex data. And when we are dealing with data sets that have many dimensions or variables, it becomes impossible to visualize them directly. Unsupervised learning can help us reduce this complexity while preserving the important information. Another goal is to discover subgroups among variables or observations. Maybe our data naturally falls into distinct clusters, or perhaps certain variables tend to move together or in patterns. A third important goal is dimension reduction, finding ways to represent our data using fewer variables while keeping most of the important information intact. In this course, we will focus on two main methods. First is the principal component analysis, or PCA, which is great for visualization and dimension reduction. And second is clustering, which helps us finding natural groupings in our data. Both of these approaches give us powerful tools to uncover hidden structure in our dataset. You might be wondering why supervised learning is important, especially when unsupervised learning is important, especially when we have so much of supervised learning tools. Well, there are several important reasons why unsupervised learning can matter. First, it's worth noting that unsupervised learning is more subjective than supervised learning. There is no single correct answer we are trying to predict, which means different approaches might yield different insights, all of which might be valid. But despite this subjectivity, unsupervised learning has growing importance across many fields. In cancer research, for instance, it's being used to identify subtypes of cancer from gene expression data, leading to more targeted treatments. In marketing, companies use it for customer segmentation based on purchase history, allowing for more personalized marketing strategies. And in entertainment, streaming services used unsupervised learning to group movies by viewer preference and therefore power recommendations. Perhaps one of the biggest practical advantages is that it's often easier to collect unlabeled data. In supervised learning, we need human experts to annotate or label our data, which can be expensive or time consuming. Unsupervised learning lets us work with raw, unlabeled data directly, and there's a lot more of that available in the world. So, as data continues to grow in volume and complexity, these unsupervised techniques become increasingly valuable tools in our analytical toolkit. So let's begin with our first technique, which is principal component analysis, or PCA in short. PCA is all about creating a low dimensional representation of our data. Imagine you have a data with dozens or even hundreds of variables. It is impossible to visualize them directly. PCA helps us reduce this complexity while keeping most of the important information. What PCA does is that it finds directions, what we call components, where our data varies the most. Each component is actually a linear combination of our original features. And think of it as like creating new super variables that capture the most important patterns in our data. These components have a special ordering. The first component captures the most variation in the data. The second captures the second most, the third captures the third most, and so on. This natural ranking helps us decide how many components to keep. One really nice property of PCA is that these components are uncorrelated with each other. Each one captures a different, independent aspect of the variation in our data, which makes them particularly useful for understanding complex data sets. So here's an example of what makes PCA more this useful. In this scatter plot, we have data about population and ad spending for 100 different cities. Each dot represents one city. The green line is our first principal component direction. Note that how it is pointing along the direction where the data varies the most. If we were to project all our data points into this line, we would capture the maximum possible variance with a single dimension. The blue dashed line represents our second principal component. It is perpendicular to the first one and captures the second most variation in the data. These two components together give us a new coordinate system that's optimized for this particular data set. What's interesting here is that most of the variation follows a diagonal pattern. Cities with larger populations tend to have higher ad spending. PCA automatically identifies this pattern without having us to specify it. If we were to use just the first principal component, we would still capture most of the information in this data set, effectively reducing it from 2 dimensions to 1. So, why would we use PCA in practice? There are several important applications. First, it's excellent for dimension reduction. By keeping only the components that explain most of the variance, we can dramatically reduce the number of variables we are working with while preserving the important information. Second, it's great for data visualization. We can take high dimensional data and project it onto a 2D or even 3D, making it possible to visualize complex information. PCA is also commonly used as a pre-processing step for other algorithms. Many machine learning methods perform better when the input features are uncorrelated, which is exactly what PCA gives us. It can also help us find underlying patterns or factors in our data that aren't obviously visible to us from the original variables. Another practical use is dealing with multicollinearity. Where our variables are highly correlated with each other, that can cause problems in some analysis. A key question over here is then how many components to keep, and that's what we will talk about next. When using PCA, we need to decide on how many components to keep. Remember, we can have as many principal components as we have original variables, but the whole point is to reduce dimensions. So we want to keep as few as possible. One approach is to look at the proportion of variance explained by each component. The first graph on the left shows us exactly that. The proportion of variance explained by each component is what is plotted against a number of components. As you can see that the first component explains about 60% of the total variance. The second one explains about 25%, and then it drops off dramatically after that. The second graph shows the cumulative proportion of variance explained. We can see that the first two components together explain about 85% of the total variance. and we need all four to explain 100%. A common technique is to look for an elbow in this plot. This is called the scree plot, especially the first one. The idea here is to find the point where adding more components give us diminishing returns. Here we might decide that two components are enough since there is a clear drop-off after the second component. The bottom line is that we want to keep the components that explain most of the variance while discarding those that contribute little. This gives us a much simpler representation of our data without losing too much information. One crucial aspect of PCA that's often overlooked is scaling. When applying PCA, you need to be careful about the scale of your variables. Scaling matters because our variables can have different units or have different ranges of values. So when you're trying to implement a PCA, those with larger scales will tend to dominate the analysis. For example, if you have one variable measured in thousands, like income in dollars, and other in small units like age in years, the income variable will have a much larger influence on the principal component simply because of its scale. The standard practice is to center our variables to have a zero mean and have standardize it by subtracting the mean and dividing it by the standard deviation. This process is called standardization, and it ensures that all variables contribute equally to the analysis. Think of it in this way. We want PCA to tell us which variables explain the most variation, but not which variables happen to be measured in larger units. Proper scaling lets the actual relationship in the data, and rather than the arbitrary unit, determine our results. So that's what PCA is. Next, we shift gears and talk about our second major technique in unsupervised learning, which is clustering. The core goal of clustering is to partition our observations into distinct groups or clusters. We want to organize our data so that observations within the same clusters are similar to each other, while observations in different clusters are dissimilar. A key challenge in clustering is defining what we mean by similarity or distance between observations. Different distance measures can lead to very different clustering results. So these choices need to be made carefully based on our data and objectives. Clustering has a lot of applications across fields. In market segmentation, businesses group customers with similar behaviors and target them effectively. In image recognition, clustering helps identify similar regions in images. In document classifications, it can group similar texts together, and there are many, many more examples. What makes clustering particularly powerful is its ability to discover natural groupings that might not be obvious to us initially. It lets the data tell us how to get organized, rather than us imposing our perceptions on it. One of the most popular clustering methods is the k-means clustering. It's relatively simple to understand and implement, which partly explains its widespread use. K-means require us to specify the number of clusters k in advance. This is both a strength as well as a limitation. You need to have some idea about how many natural groups can exist in your data. The fundamental goal of k-means is to minimize the within cluster variation. We want each cluster to be as tight and compact as possible, with observations grouped around its cluster center. The algorithm is straightforward and iterative. We start by randomly assigning each observation to one of the k clusters. Then we compute the centroid of each cluster, which is just the mean of all points assigned to that cluster. Next, we reassign each observation to the closest centroid, and we keep repeating 2 and 3 until assignments don't change anymore. It is very simple and very effective as well for many clustering tasks. So let's walk through a visual example and see how it works in practice. In this figure, we can actually follow the algorithm step by step. In the first panel, we have our raw data. It's just a collection of points with no assigned clusters yet. You might notice that there appears to be 3 natural groupings, but the algorithm doesn't know that initially. In step 1, we randomly assign each point to one of these 3 clusters, shown by the different colors. These initial assignments are completely random. Moving to iteration 1, step 2a, we calculate the centroid of each clusters. Those are the larger circles with the black outlines. Each centroid is simply the average position of all points in that cluster. In iteration 1, step 2b, we reassign each point to the closest centroid, which results in a new clustering arrangement. We can see that the colors shifting as points change their clustering arrangements. And this process continues in iteration 2, where we recalculate the centroids based on the new assignments and then reassign points again and again. Finally, we reach the final result where the assignments no longer change. The algorithm has converged to a stable solution that nicely captures the 3 natural clusters in our data. An important note about k-means: it converges to a local minimum and not necessarily the global minimum. Different random initializations can lead to different final clusters, which is why in practice we often run k-means multiple times and pick out the best result. While k-means is popular and useful, it does have some important limitations that we should be aware of. First, it requires us to specify k, which is the number of clusters, in advance. This can be challenging if we do not have good intuition about how many natural groups should exist in the data. Second, the solution depends on the initial random centroids. As I mentioned earlier, k-means can get stuck in a local optimum, so different initializations can give different results. To mitigate this, it's a common practice to run the algorithm multiple times with different starting points. Third, k-means work best with spherical structures or spherical clusters that are roughly equal in size. It struggles with clusters of complex shapes or widely varying sizes. And fourth, it is sensitive to outliers. Even a few extreme points can significantly shift the position of a centroid and affect the entire clustering. Fifth, k-means use Euclidean distance by default, which may not be appropriate for all types of data. For categorical data or data with special structures, other distance measures might be more suitable. Lastly, in k-means, every point must belong to exactly one cluster. There is no concept of points that don't fit well into any cluster or points that might belong partially to multiple clusters. So for these situations, other clustering methods might be more appropriate. And that brings us to hierarchical clustering. Unlike k-means, this method doesn't require us to pre-specify the number of clusters, which can be an advantage when we are not sure about how many natural groups to begin with. A key feature of hierarchical clustering is that it builds a tree of clusters called a dendrogram. This tree shows us how clusters relate to each other at different levels of granularity, from individual points all the way up to a single cluster containing everything. There are 2 main approaches to hierarchical clustering. The bottom-up or agglomerative approach that starts with each observation as its own tiny cluster and then progressively merges the closest clusters until everything is in one big cluster. This is the more common approach. The top-down or divisive approach works in the opposite direction. It starts with all the observations in one cluster and then recursively splits them into smaller clusters. What makes hierarchical clustering particularly useful is that it provides a hierarchical representation of the data. We can see not just the final cluster, but the entire process of how they form and relate to each other. This gives us a richer view of the structure in our data as compared to just a flat clustering method like k-means. So let's focus on the agglomerative approach first, which is the most commonly used method. The algorithm is conceptually simple. First, we start with each observation in its own cluster. If we have n observations, we begin with n clusters, each containing just one point. Second, we compute pairwise distances between all the clusters. Initially, it's just the distance between each individual points. Third, we find and merge two closest clusters. This reduces our cluster count by 1. Fourth, we repeat steps 2 and 3 until computing new distances and merging the closest clusters until all observations end up in a single cluster. And the result of this process is known as dendrogram, a tree-like diagram that shows the entire hierarchy of clusters merging from individual points all the way up to the complete dataset. What's particularly nice about this approach is that we don't need to decide on the number of clusters up front. After creating the complete dendrogram, we can cut at any level to get the desired number of clusters. This flexibility lets us explore different cluster counts easily. And here is what a typical dendrogram looks like. This visualization is one of the most valuable aspects of this method. In a dendrogram, each vertical line represents a cluster and horizontal lines connect clusters that get merged. The height of these horizontal connections is crucial. It indicates the dissimilarity at which clusters merge. Higher connections mean merged clusters are more dissimilar to each other. To use the dendrogram, we can cut it horizontally at any height. This gives us a clustering at any particular level or dissimilarity. For example, if we cut the dendrogram at a height shown by the dotted lines, we get 4 clusters represented by different colors. What makes dendrograms so useful is that they provide a much richer information than k-means. We can see not just the final clusters, but also how they relate to each other in a hierarchical structure. Some clusters might be very similar and merge early, lower in the tree, while others remain distinct until a much higher level of dissimilarity is invoked. This hierarchical view often reveals insights about our data that we might miss in a flat clustering method. For example, we might discover that some clusters are more tightly related to each other, forming superclusters at higher levels. A critical choice in this method is how do we define the distance between clusters? When clusters contain multiple points, how do we measure how far apart they are? And this is known as the linkage method, and different choices can lead to very different clustering methods or results. There are several common linkage types. Single linkage defines the distance between the clusters as the minimum distance between any 2 points, one for each cluster. It tends to create long stretched out clusters and is sensitive to noise, but can identify clusters of complex shape. The complete linkage uses the maximum distance between any 2 points from different clusters. This creates more compact, equally sized clusters and is less sensitive to noise, but can break up natural clusters if they are large and have irregular shapes. Average linkage takes the average of all pairwise distances between points in 2 clusters. This is a middle ground and that often works well in practice. The centroid linkage measures the distance between the centroids or the means of the clusters. It is intuitive and can sometimes lead to inversion of the dendrogram, where clusters appear to merge at a lower dissimilarity. So, now that we have covered both k-means and hierarchical clustering, how do we decide which one to use? So let's compare their strengths and limitations. K-means has several advantages. It's faster, especially for large data sets with many observations. It is simple to interpret since each cluster is represented by its centroid, but it also requires us to pre-specify the number of clusters, which is not always obvious. Hierarchical clustering, on the other hand, provides the entire clustering structure in the form of a dendrogram. We don't need to pre-specify the number of clusters upfront, and we can decide after seeing the full structure. The downside is that it's more computationally intensive, particularly when we are dealing with large data sets. And it's also quite sensitive to the choice of distance measure and linkage method. In practice, these methods are often complementary. You might use hierarchical clustering first to explore the data and then determine a reasonable number of clusters, and then apply k-means with that specific k value for the final clustering. Sometimes researchers even used hybrid approaches, starting with k-means to get initial clusters, and then apply hierarchical methods within those clusters for a more refined structure. The best approach ultimately depends on your specific goals, the size and nature of your dataset, and the computational resources that are available to you. When applying clustering techniques in real-world scenarios, there are several practical issues that we need to consider. Should we scale or standardize our variables? This is especially important when our features have different units of measurements. Standardizing variables to have zero mean and standard deviation 1 often makes sense because it prevents variables with larger scales from dominating the clustering. But there are cases where the natural cluster contains important information, so this decision needs to be made thoughtfully. Second, what distance or similarity measure should we use? Euclidean measure is the most common, but correlation-based distances might be more appropriate when we care about patterns rather than absolute values. For categorical data, other measures like the Jaccard similarity might make more sense. The choice of distance measure should align with what similarity means in your specific context. Third, how do we determine the optimal number of clusters? For k-means, we might try different values of k and evaluate them. For hierarchical clustering, we can examine the dendrogram. Various quantitative methods exist, like the elbow method or the silhouette analysis, but these should complement rather than replace domain expertise. Fourth is which variables should drive our clustering. Not all features are equally important. Feature selection might be necessary to focus on the most relevant attributes and avoid noise. Finally, how do we validate that our clusters are meaningful? Unlike supervised learning, there is no straightforward accuracy metric. Validation often involves domain expertise to determine if the clusters make sense in the context and serve the intended purpose. So here's a real world example of clustering. The visualization shows the results of clustering gene expression data from the breast cancer patients. Each column represents a patient, each row a gene, and the colors indicate the expression levels. Red for high expression, green for low. By applying clustering techniques to this genomic data, researchers have identified distinct subtypes of breast cancer that are not obvious from traditional clinical features. Notice how the dendrogram at the top shows the hierarchical relationships between these subtypes. What makes this example so important is that different subtypes have very different prognosis and respond differently to treatments. Some subtypes are more aggressive, whereas others are more responsive to specific therapies. This discovery has led to more personalized treatment approaches. Instead of treating all breast cancers the same way, doctors can now tailor treatments based on the molecular subtype of cancer. For some patients, this might mean more aggressive treatment right away. For others, it might mean avoiding unnecessary treatments that are unlikely to help. This is a good example of how unsupervised learning can lead to discoveries with real-world impact. The patterns revealed through clustering weren't specifically searched for, but they emerged from the data and provided insights that has that have transformed clinical practice. So let's briefly touch upon an interesting kind of a bonus topic here, which is matrix completion, which addresses a very common problem in the real world data, that is missing values. Real data sets often have gaps where values are missing. A simple approach people often use is mean imputation. Just replace the missing value with the average of the available values for that variable. But this ignores the relationships between variables. A more sophisticated approach uses the correlations among variables to make a better guess about those missing values. And this is where matrix completion comes in. Matrix completion via PCA works by approximating our incomplete data matrix with a low-rank representation. The process is iterative. We fill in missing values with some initial guess, perform PCA, use the resulting components to make better guesses for the missing values, and repeat until there is some convergence. This technique has found impressive applications in the recommender system. The famous Netflix prize competition was essentially a matrix completion problem predicting missing entries in a partially observed matrix of user movie ratings. The key insight is that we can leverage the structure and patterns of the observed data to make intelligent guesses about the unobserved parts. Rather than treating each missing value in isolation, we can use the relationships across the entire dataset. So let's wrap up our discussion with a quick recap of the key points. Number one, unsupervised learning is all about discovering structure in our data without the guidance of a target variable. Unlike supervised learning, there is no correct answers that we are trying to predict. We are exploring the inherent patterns and patterns within the data itself. Second, we covered two main techniques, PCA, that helps us reduce dimensionality while preserving variance. It identifies directions of maximum variations in our data, allowing us to represent complex data sets more simply while keeping most of the important information. We also explored clustering methods, K-means and hierarchical. K-means is a straightforward and efficient method but requires pre-specifying the number of clusters. Hierarchical clustering builds a tree of clusters, giving us a richer representation of how observations group together at different levels of similarity. An important point to remember is that supervised learning is inherently subjective. There is no single correct answer. Different approaches might yield different insights, all of which could be valid depending on your objective. The beauty of unsupervised learning is that it lets the data speak for itself, revealing patterns and structures that might not be obvious at first glance. As you apply these techniques, let your choice of method be guided by your specific goals and the nature of your data. These tools offer powerful ways to gain insights from complex data sets across virtually any domain, from genomics to marketing, from image analysis to document classification. They are essential components of modern data science toolkit. So that's it. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, do please let me know.